We were talking offline and you mentioned that you worked on one such project. So going through that process, you actually realized there was opportunity to make design decisions
Yeah,
to improve, right, the carbon footprint of that product, but also create value because there was also cost savings.
absolutely. Now, just as a caveat at the beginning of this, I want to say this doesn't work all the time. That you can make things cheaper if you make them more sustainable, but the majority of the times and for the majority of products, this is true. So in this mount, it was a metal motor mount where there were 9 pieces to this, and it was built mainly in the same material. And we looked into, okay, where is it that we can make beneficial changes to this design? We managed to realize that there were 4 parts of this which either didn't need to be a single part or didn't need to be in that part at all. And so we changed this from it there being 9 pieces in it into 5 pieces. And also we managed to change 2 of the plastic pieces into metal pieces, which were then the same material as everything else was together. By doing so, we managed to tweak the design and reduce the CO2 by approximately, I think it was 29% from reduction in logistics. And also by having less material, you have less carbon output because it costs less to do so. And this ended up, after we'd done this design change, we saved the company over €1 million in a year.
Hello, everyone. Today we have the honor of talking to James Trebilco. He is a sustainability director at HCL Tech, which is a large engineering conglomerate. And in today's episode, we're going to explore a number of topics: LCAs, how LCAs can be useful for businesses to generate value, and generally explore, sustainability regulations, as they're an increasingly important part of how businesses have to run their day to day. James, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Andrea. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think this is going to be a good conversation. Just to start us off, I mean, you're the sustainability expert here. Walk us through, how has sustainability regulation evolved over the last decades, and just provide us some history that I think will be important for context of this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So the way that really when we kind of going in to think about sustainability, it's a relatively new thing in terms of kind of the history of man over things. We've been buying and selling things for millennia. And this is kind of where, the financial side of things have been relatively well understood. And the majority of people, especially in the upper echelons of business, know how things work financially. And so with this, they're very clear about what a P&L sheet would look like, where the money is going to and coming from, and how these things are equated. But only until, well, it was about 1980, I think it was 1987, where there was the Brundtland report that came out. That was really the first time that people really started to become aware of sustainability and the need to look into this type of accounting as well. At that time, of course, it was very young, and this was just the first part of it. But it was really since about then in the late 80s. And then this developed a little bit further when people started to realize this was something that needed to be focused upon. Then you start to see things like the SBTI, so the science-based targets, and they brought about a range of different targets which crossed various different points of the ESG, so the environmental, social, and governance spectrum, looking into different areas. And this is very much at the higher level. This isn't at the business level yet. This is very much the global level and at the country level of what needs to be looked into. And even now, I mean, those things are still embedded in a lot of the sustainability statements that companies will bring out. So these are things that happens in kind of the I suppose, mid to late 90s that are still being used today. These things then get translated into finer and finer detail as they progress. So these SBTI standards and these different global standards which people start to look into get refined into different areas. So you look into some things in the social side. So you're looking into slavery acts, for example, into government in terms of how fair it is and what needs to be looked into and how those companies need to be regulated. And then the environmental side, where you can really dig down into details. And that's where you can start looking at things like toxicity, into gas emissions. And that's kind of where I look at more so than the other 2 parts of ESG, into those different areas of how these things can be accounted for. When you start to bring these focuses into the more specific targets, that's really when you can get into the details and start to hold people account to things. And this is where the progression of these sustainability statements, which more and more are becoming mandatory for companies to put out, or now they are mandatory, at least in Europe and I believe in the US as well. So that not only is this an important place of information for shareholders when they look at the finance statement, but they also look at it from the sustainability point of view. So there's two different parts that a company's shareholders can look into to say, okay, how is this business being run responsibly? So that's really where these things have developed from that kind of early stage up until about now. I mean, there's many different parts of this which can be broken into. I mean, I can take, for example, here something like in the building sector, there are other parts that come into this where you're looking at things like LEED and BREEAM certifications. And these LEED and BREEAM certifications are things that show so the company themselves can use those targets to say, right, we can prove that we are using these targets in a responsible way to help us drive our company or drive our building, whichever it is, into a good direction. So you get different types of classification within these standards. So you can be bronze, silver, gold, platinum. You can get different points in here. And by doing different things, you can show that you are more responsible or less responsible. I think in terms of the regulation part, I'll probably stop there as I'll want to dive into a few of these things later. But for now, I think in terms of the regulations and the history, I think that covers it at a high level.
Yeah, fair. And just like listening to you, like obviously it sounds like the first Tribber was in the 1980s, late 1980s with this report. But what was the main driver and led to this first report to come out, but also for further initiatives in the years to build on that report? Was it climate science? Was it investor pressure? Like what were the drivers? Give us some context there.
I think at that time it wasn't investor pressure because this wasn't an area which was understood. This was predominantly the the issue that we are very aware of today, which is global warming, with the rising temperatures and pressures of the stresses on the environment that any of these carbon emissions toxicity, as I was referring to before, starts to bring about. Rising sea levels puts pressure on communities, especially around the coast, but also in areas which are susceptible to drought or to where there's crop damage. Anything where there is this kind of potential was starting to rise around this time. And so this was where these environmental factors really started to highlight this is an issue. And then from that, more investigation, more research was done. And it was shown that, okay, we now need to look into these different areas. Later on, I'm sure we'll go into things like scope 1, 2, and 3, which branch out into how global things can be. At that time, everybody, I also believe, was looking very much at their own little part of whichever chain they were a part of, be it a manufacturer or a supplier or whichever other part of that chain they were. They were looking at this part, and I think it's easy to silo oneself to say, okay, this is my little bit that I'm doing here, but actually what that or how your little part is affected and affects the rest of the big chain. And that part was also explored throughout the 90s and coming into the early 2000s of what is the pressure, where does that come from, and how is that affecting the global climate? From that is where there was increasing investor pressure. But honestly speaking, this didn't really come about until regulations started to come in. And it's the regulatory pressures, especially now in the EU, which are really starting to drive things because honestly, when coming down to it, people, as much as they like to say that they are environmentally minded, oftentimes it comes down to how much does everything cost? And so that's where the regulations do well in pushing people in a certain direction because they're saying, okay, this is a mandatory thing now. Furthermore, you have some other parts to it which come into not only with the regulations, which is the stick part, you have government subsidies and incentive schemes and so on, which is a bit more of the carrot. And so they are things where, I mean, I'm taking building as the use case here, where certain governments are bringing in incentive schemes, tax breaks, grants, and so forth, which lower costs for them to invest in a certain way. And
Sure.
so by bringing that knowledge that was brought about from the scientific and the environmental focus at the beginning, you can say, okay, there are actually big benefits that come from this further down the line financially. So when having this conversation, generally, yes, you can talk to people in terms of carbon emissions if you want to, but that isn't the language. So referring back to what I was saying before in terms of people understanding how money works, but not necessarily how carbon chains work or, how the environment works. If you start to speak in the same language, which is essentially bringing it down to a dollar value or whichever currency one's in, then you can start to have that conversation, which once you say, okay, it's cheaper, maybe you get a tax break, maybe that you can go down and look into certain innovations which are here, then you start to get that investor pressure, which starts to help with that rolling ball.
You already hinted at it in your answer just now, which was that the real driver was the EU driving pressure through regulation. So let's take the lens to today. What are the key regulations that you think companies should be aware of?
Very interesting question. This really depends in the sector you're in, and it depends at what level you're at. And it also depends on what maybe position one is in their company. Now taking the EU as an example, there are a few large ones here. So one is CBAM. So this one is relatively new, is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is a tax which is then put on companies who operate outside of the EU, bringing products into the EU. So there is then a carbon tax costed to that product. Everything that's happened outside of Europe is then taxed at a certain amount when it comes into the EU. And the point of that is so that a company can't up sticks and leave and go somewhere else in the world to then keep producing CO2 outside and bring it in at a cheaper rate. So you're enforcing the manufacturing to be done in a responsible way, no matter where you are on the planet, if you want to sell your products within Europe. So that's kind of what CBAM is. This goes hand in hand really with ETS, so the emissions trading scheme. So this is where the carbon credits that companies are allotted by the governments will change price as time goes on to become more expensive. So this is where they're enforcing companies to change their ways by saying, look, either you can keep producing CO2, but it's going to cost you a lot, and there will be fines put on top of this, or you can change your ways and become more sustainable, in which case you won't be hit by this annual penalty year on year of producing this extra carbon. And that will then obviously harm you, like I was saying before, in your wallet. So this is where that type of regulation fits hand in hand with the understandings of business. That's just one looking at kind of the tax situation. There are other ones where you're looking at data transparency. So these are things like CSRD, where this is looking into data transparency. Another thing that goes hand in hand with this is a new one which is coming out in the EU, which is DPP, Digital Product Passports. Digital Product Passport looks into, it could be anything. So right now I've got what's a good example? Okay, I've got a battery pack here. So that would have a QR code associated with it that anyone down that chain could be able to scan that QR code and get the relevant data for that product as it's coming through the system. So let's say as a border official, so in the example that I was just choosing then, and they could say, okay, I understand where all of the parts of this battery pack come from. I can work out how much carbon or from what suppliers it was where these things were brought forward. This at the moment is only in a few areas. So in terms of agriculture, cement, steel, there's 6 in total at the moment, but this is going to grow as time goes on. So this is a way of increasing the transparency. And really, this is something that has been seen where transparency is the first part. So in the last couple of years, in terms of the regulations, it's been a focus to say, look, you don't have to do anything at the moment. We just want you to be transparent as a company. So be as transparent as you can. We'll work out what needs to be done, where the big hotspots are, and then we can start to focus on those areas down the line. And with that, it'll also open companies' eyes, producers' eyes, supply chain experts' eyes to say, right, where is it that we need to start to work? So this is where that transparency aspect really comes into things. And that is what some of these regulations are pushing. Now, I'm only focusing on a few here. There are also a plethora of others. There's the GHG protocol. There's things from the Kyoto protocol, the Montreal also protocol. So that one looks into CFCs being emitted. You've got the ISO standards. And so these are all different understood standards globally. GRI standards is another one, which most companies, especially the compliance officers, should know, that brings about these transparency, and it brings it about in a way that we can compare apples with apples. So company A can compare with company B because we're operating by the same standards.
Yeah, fair. I just have a like, listening to you talk, I think I do want to deep dive as a follow-up into the transparency topic. But before we do that, just listening to you talk, it seems like all these regulations, obviously they're well-intentioned. But the first instinct to have is like, wow, that seems also like a really significant just admin burden on companies to just do their business day to day. And typically, like admin, when the admin work is significant, that benefits large companies rather versus vis-a-vis small players because obviously they have the ability just to absorb their admin as part of their day to day more easily, right, than a
Yeah.
smaller like SMEs. And the European economy is actually mostly built on SMEs in most countries, not on large corporations.
hmm
What have you observed as these regulations have like been released into the European Union and the different markets? Are
hmm
they having the impact that they were desiring, or are they actually like hurting industry in some way?
Well, the way that these were brought about was it was done in a staged process. So the first set were for the huge companies, the really, really, really big ones, which, as you kind of correctly say, they've already got the administrative force in place to be able to deal with this kind of structure. And don't get me wrong, it was quite the shock to them as well in terms of what it is they have to do, where they find the information. That's a whole other part of things. How do you source all of this type of information? Because it's never been stored before. So, up until this point, people were storing a certain type of information. And now another regulation has come in and said, "Oh, by the way, we also now need X, Y, and Z. Where on earth do we find this? This could be anywhere." And
Right.
so you've got all of this archaic data that needs to kind of be brought through. And they were saying we need to have this data for the last 10 years. And people were saying, I have literally no idea where to find this. And so this is where I think a few of the regulatory bodies as well were saying, look, we can go in one of two ways. Either you have the data, or we can say, here is the approximate level that we think you're at. And we expect over the next couple of years you to verify whether or not this data is true. And in these next couple of years, start to collect this data in the right places. But right now, we'll kind of give you a bit of leeway in saying how it is that you're meant to be collecting this data and then being able to transfer this information to the auditor. So that's one side of things where they were going after the super huge companies first. Then year on year on year, so in 2026, 2027, I believe, it's where they're starting to bring it into the SME. So they have had time to think about, okay, what is it that we need to bring? How is it we're going to start to manage this data? Where is it that we're going to start focusing on? And so it's given them a little bit of time to do so. Now, there was an Omnibus 1 and 2 that was brought out by the European Union around this because there was some lobbying against what needs to be brought out in terms of transparency to say, look, this is slowing companies down. This is getting very difficult for everyone. It's costing everyone a lot of money. And is it actually bringing anything about? So there was some lobbying that was done, which has changed a little bit what is needed in the regulations. Whether or not this is good or bad is a subjective opinion on whether or not this data is useful or not, of course. It also tends where there are companies which maybe have something a bit more to hide to lobby against. But again, that's not a fair opinion to have across everybody. Sometimes it is an administrative thing, but it does maybe tend to go in that way when it comes to how do companies want to be transparent? How transparent do they actually want to be? And how much do they want to use this as an advantage? Because also you can use these things as a derivative. So it's not purely, hey, here's the problem, can we solve it? But there's also all of the consumer view on things. So I remember doing this in a previous company where we were looking into how or what is the appetite for the customer in terms of sustainable products. And if we look to Scandinavia, and Scandinavia have always seemed to be the area of the world that has been most progressive when it comes to sustainability, they were the ones who, if you took two products, you could compare them side by side, and the customer in Scandinavia would be happier to pay more for a less well performing product, which was more sustainable in comparison to the other products, which would be cheaper, it'd be better performing, but it was less sustainable because that was what the customer sentiment was. So depending on where you are in the world, your eventual product may need to differ, or you start to maybe, if you are a manufacturer of a certain type of product, you say, okay, well, let's focus on this market first and see how we can improve in this market. So it depends a little bit on customer sentiment as well. So how much does it affect the sales in a certain area? And you can use that to your advantage then, because then you can say, okay, great. Well, we've become more sustainable in this area. We can now have marketing campaigns. We can start changing our branding for things. Now, changing branding is even another part here, because now we have the potential for greenwashing. And we've seen this on a few times. There have been adverts which have had to be taken off air because they've made a claim that actually has turned out, yeah, it's true in some cases, but it's not completely true. And so you've got to be very careful when saying, hey, by the way, we are now a sustainable product. So like, actually, what do you mean by this? And then we go into even more parts, into the definition of terms, because what is bio? What is sustainability? You know, unless these things are globally understood as with a specific definition of this means exactly this, you're kind of in trouble. You know, I mean, with the bio example, if you go to a supermarket and you say GM free or bio, do the majority of people know exactly what that means? No, I don't think so. And so that's where you need to be careful in saying, this is what we're going for. But as I say, that's an aside. So there are some other benefits. There's also innovations that can come about from these things as well.
Yeah,
So
so let's talk
that's
about that.
right.
If you
Yeah.
don't mind. How do these, let's say you have a company, I'm assuming you work with companies that have gone through the motion of implementing these regulations or reflecting
Mhm.
on them and taking action. Once you have transparency, how does that transparency help with design decisions? For example, in industries like automotive or construction?
Yeah. Well, there are many different tools depending on what it is you're looking at, but the industry standard, which is generally accepted, is something called an LCA, or a life cycle analysis. And this will go hand in hand with something called an EPD, an environmental product declaration, but I'll come back to describing what that is in a little bit. But the LCA, which is the life cycle analysis, is split into various different parts. So you have your raw material extraction, you have your transport of your raw materials to the production of the parts, you have the manufacturing, or kind of the assembling of your part, then you have shipping to the shop, let's say. So it could be any part of that, B2B, B2C, it depends on how that works. The usage phase, when it's in the customer's hands, and then the final stage, which is either waste disposal, and then on top of that, then you have the recycling part. So are there any bits which then can be taken back and reused? And so oftentimes the first part of that, so the A, B, C, D part, so it's split into 5 parts, A through to E. The first part of that is usually negative in terms of the effect onto the environment. So it costs carbon to make these things, be it in terms of the actual material itself being extracted from the earth, be it the energy that it takes to do so, be it in the fuel that it takes to move these things from A to B. So that's where it costs. And this then can be put out in this LCA, and you can start to highlight points on this as you're going through to say, okay, that's a big cost. That's a big cost. So let's take an example in terms of, I don't know, manufacturing. You can see on the chart on the world map behind me that you can see China, which is going to be actually quite far away from Europe. So if you're manufacturing in China, or you're extracting material in Canada, and then you're shipping it somewhere else, you're going to have a very large transport link between those, which is going to cost a lot in carbon to ship from one part to another part. So that may be a bit that you go, right, okay, let's look into this. Is it possible for us to manufacture or extract this material from somewhere a bit closer to cut down on this chain? Or maybe there's a better way of moving it from A to B that costs less, or is maybe a more efficient way of doing it. So that's one way you can do it. There's also, so I spoke about the cost part in terms of CO2. You've also got the other end of it. So that's where you have to start thinking about the design thinking of your product. And there's something called the 6 Rs. So these are how much you can gain back from the design part. So in one case, so I'll use an example of the Nespresso pods. Now, these were changed after they looked into the design of this, but they were an alloy of plastic and metal. And sure, they did their function in the pod when they had to be used very well. They were light, they were cheap, they did exactly everything they needed to do. But you get to the end of life, and now you can't separate that material and that plastic. So that is now just waste. That is now thrown away. And that's the worst part of this. And then you can walk up this 6 Rs part. So you start to go up into burning. Actually, burning is the next one up there because you can take some of the energy that's kept in that back into something else. So you can heat something with it. You can recycle, actually, is the next one up here. So that's where you're taking your material and you're changing it into something else. But of course, that's quite costly because you're having to expend energy again to be able to change something from one thing into another thing. And don't get me wrong, recycling is good and you should do it at home if possible to do so. But there are better options. And those better options are things where you can, let's say, reuse. So that's one of the other R's where you can take a bit out of something which is still in fully working condition and use it again. And that costs limited energy. And the best one would be completely reused. So I at the moment live in Munich in Germany, and they have a wonderful system, which is, well, it's called the fan system, but that's essentially the deposit system, where when you buy a bottle of beer, you buy the beer itself, but you also spend 8 cents on the beer bottle itself. When you finish with that, you take it back to a center where you get 8 cents back yourself, and that bottle can just be washed and reused. There is no extra energy. It doesn't need to be shipped very far. It can be washed, repurposed, or not repurposed, but reused for the same purpose. And that is then right at the very top of things. So all of that comes back into the design thinking around the product itself. Now, obviously, for a glass bottle, that's an easy thing to do. It's one material that does the same thing over and over again. When you're into a much more complex product, then it becomes much more difficult to be able to do so. But still, it's something that needs to be taken back and appreciated when you're looking at that LCA, right the way back to the design phase. So that's where this LCA really comes into its own and say, okay, here are the hotspots. How do we take out these hotspots from this LCA and take that into the design phase? Have that conversation with, let's say, the supply chain manager, with the logistics manager, with the material. So who's sourcing and what is it that needs to be done? And maybe we can change things about here. And that's really where an LCA can come into its own. Now, the
Yes,
LCA is something which is kept in-house. Sorry, Andrea, I'll just finish
please,
because I
please
promised
keep
about
going.
EPDs. The LCA is something that is an in-house document, and then the EPD is something that is then used to say, here is our product, here is how good it is, essentially, or how bad it is. But the EPD does it in a way that you can communicate this information to a customer without releasing any information which might be sensitive to your company. Because the LCA really goes into the nuts and bolts. The EPD gives it to the customer with the information they need, but no more information that might be commercially sensitive.
Yeah, so we were actually just trying to bring it to. I really like the example of the water bottle, the beer bottle. We have a similar system here in the Netherlands. But
Hmm.
what about, you did mention like it's not as straightforward with more complex systems. And we were talking offline and you mentioned that you worked on one such projects with regards to a motor mount and
Hmm.
how you went through the LCA with a customer, and going through that process, you actually realized there was opportunity to make design decisions
Yeah,
to improve, right, the carbon footprint of that product, but also actually create value for the company because there was also cost savings. Can you tell
yeah.
us more about that?
Absolutely. Now, just as a caveat at the beginning of this, I want to say this doesn't work all the time. So obviously it would be a wonderful thing and a real, home run if you can say it's always true that you can make things cheaper if you make them more sustainable. That isn't always true, but the majority of the times and for the majority of products, this is true. So in this mount, I mean, this was something where we looked into, it was a metal, yeah, motor mount where I think there was 9 pieces to this, and it was built in it was mainly in the same material. It wasn't completely in the same material, but it was mainly in the same material at the beginning. And we looked into, okay, where is it that we can make beneficial changes to this design? What is it that we need to look at? And what we did was we looked into the design, as I was saying, in the previous kind of intro into this, and we managed to realize that there were 4 parts of this which either didn't need to be a single part or didn't need to be in that part at all. And so we changed this from it there being 9 pieces in it into 5 pieces. And also we managed to change 2 of the plastic pieces into metal pieces, which were then the same material as everything else was together. By doing so, we managed to tweak the design and reduce the CO2 by approximately, I think it was 29% from reduction in logistics. And also by having less material, you have less carbon output because it costs less to do so. And by doing so, of course, by reducing the amount of pieces, you have many other benefits that come on top of this. So the thing is more light. By doing so, you reduce your transportation. by having less material, you have to buy less material. So the thing is cheaper itself. You reduce the amount of carbon, and therefore your carbon costs or your carbon taxes are also reduced from this. So by doing so, not only have you made the product with a lesser CO2 emission and kind of a negative impact on the planet, but at the same time, you're able to make significant cost savings. And this ended up, after we'd done this design change, we saved the company over €1 million in the year by having that reduction, because we were just able to take out some of those pieces. And so it was a win across the board. And
Fair.
that is where you can really see how the regulation, which drives the transparency, which then drives this LCA creation, which then identifies the hotspots, drives that innovation and saying, okay, where is it that we need to process? Where is it that we need to look to be able to find those hotspots, push those parts instead of saying, okay, how do we just increase the price? Well, it's even better if you can reduce the cost. They're the two ways you can really look to earning more money around a product. You can increase the price or reduce the cost. And if you reduce the cost, you win double. So that's really where the focus of LCA can come about. And as I said, further in the previous thing that I was talking about regarding the branding and the customer experience and so on, you can say, not only is it cheaper, dear customer, or maybe even if you keep it the same price, you can say, hey, customer, it's the same price, but it's now reduced in carbon by X amount. And you get to keep producing the same product for that company who are already happy with it, and you're making a cost saving. So everybody wins across the board there.
I want to just keep it again very practical because
Yeah.
listening to you, very interesting example of the motor mount. But most companies don't have a single product, right? Let's take an extreme case, a company like 3M, which has, I don't know, but I'm gonna guess 100,000 products SKUs, right, in their
Hmm.
in their in their product portfolio. And they have maybe, let's say, an internal team of 10 people, 100 people, however that many is, that has
Hmm.
to go and do LCAs. They have a company strategic commitment. They say, okay, we want to do LCAs on our portfolio, but do you have a huge portfolio, right? From your experience, do companies have maybe certain levers from the outside where they say it's better to start with XYZ like products because typically that's where we have the biggest bang for buck, especially when you have a lot of portfolio to go through this process and a limited amount of resources to do that.
So this is where it is, again, a bit of a strategic decision on what is taken forward, because an LCA can be done in a day or it can be done in 6 months. And that depends on the complexity of the product, right? So use 3M. So 3M, I believe, also make Post-it notes. So they would have probably 3 pieces, 4 pieces maybe, if we think of the paper, the glue, the plastic that it comes in, and the ink that they use to print the plastic. In terms of what goes into that product, it's a relatively simple product that you can think, okay, how do we look into this LCA? And so there's only 4 parts to that. If you're taking in a much, much, much more complex product, then it's going to really take a long time. And the time is not necessarily in once you've created the LCA, getting the audit stuff. Yes, that takes a bit of time because you always go to a third party auditor to verify the data so that you can say, yeah, this has been audited, because otherwise you could write whatever you wanted to. So it always goes to a third party auditor. But like I was saying previously, it's on the data management and what data is found where in your system. Now, this is also brought maybe to a further complexity where you have had companies which have bought other companies. So as companies grow, they usually acquire a new company because they're in a certain field. And that's how a lot of companies grow, which also means they grow with and they also bring in their version of data storage, whatever that was, which is probably not conducive with the other way that the parent company was bringing in data or storing data. And so oftentimes it does become quite complex where it's, okay, again, where is all of this data? And that's the archive data that they have. Now, moving from this day onwards, this is where good data management right from the off is the most important thing to be able to get everything else done. If you have good data management and you know where everything is, if you know where everything is in your BOM, if you have a well laid out transport logistics network where you have a good relationship with your suppliers so that you can say, hey, supplier X, we need this data, and they can send it through to you in a verified form. It can whack into that data management system, into the data lake, and then onwards. And you can be able to process an LCA faster and then kind of get to the real benefits quicker. To kind of come back to the crux of your question, LCAs take time. Best way of doing it would be if there are similarities between products, or if there are common products which go into many different products, then it would make sense to look at an LCA for that part, because then you could fill many different product LCAs at the same time, or at least get close to. It would also probably go into which are your highest selling products, or which are the ones with the biggest volume sales, because they're going to be the ones where customers really are driven towards it. Another way is going back to what I was saying about the incentives and the certifications you can get when you're looking at things like LEED and BREEAM. So in the building sector, there are the way that the LEED and BREEAM system works is you get certain points for doing certain things in different ways. Now, they're more complex certifications than that, because it depends if you're building a building, or if you're operating a building, or if you're maintaining it, or so there's different types. But if a building is built with materials that have an LCA, then that building gets more points into the LEED and BREEAM system. And so your company then has a better score that you can then use. So there's benefits all the way through the chain. So it's a strategic decision on what is the eventual benefit that I want to get after having done this. Is it products? Is it innovation? Is it marketing? Or is it I just want to know so I can kind of move in the right direction?
So you also mentioned the fact that LCAs are complex because once you've gone through this entire internal audit, you need an external audit in order to prove that it's an unbiased assessment on the carbon footprint of our product.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Because listening to you makes a lot of sense in theory, but in practice, that seems like really complicated. How do you go about finding auditors? How do the regulators make sure that what is being audited is correct? Just tell us more about that.
There are a few third-party auditors which are kind of the industry standard. I mean, we've spent probably over the last 10 years where it's been a bit of a wild west, where there have been regulations, certifications, various different things popping up all over the place, because where there's certification, there's money, right? If you can accredit something, if you start an accreditation scheme and you go, I will certify you by doing this, here is Andrea's stamp of approval, you could make millions doing this. But the question is it credible, right? Does anybody care? Do you want it, right? And then this has happened over the last, let's say, decade or so. And now it's starting to be where different providers have started to rise to the top. And they are purely the third-party auditors. So that at that point, they're just saying, look, we don't mind who you are, but we will honestly and like look at what it is that you're bringing to us and come back to it. And it depends where you are, because there are different regulations in different places. So you have sites like One Click LCA, for example, or SEMA Pro. These are two sites which are LCA software providers that then you're able to kind of connect with that third-party auditor to say, right, you can go and do this if you want to do so. And so these are some partners which you can use to then go ahead and verify the data. But obviously that it depends on where you are, because some are like, for example, if you operate in France, there's a very specific set of regulations and they focus very heavily on some things. It's just different in Italy. In Italy, they focus more on labeling, for example. If you want to look at, I don't know, let's look at packaging. Packaging is fascinating because there's so many different variants of how that's being regulated. If you look at South Korea, they look at minimizing void space rather than what type of material it is. I mean, maybe, I don't know, I'm sure some people have had it where if you buy something off Amazon, you'll get a huge box and then the thing inside it is about this big. And you're like,
Totally.
well, okay. And so that's where you need to look at, okay, well, actually, if you're in South Korea, or the South Korean regulation would massively penalize you for doing so because it's about void space. Whereas some others do it on weight. And so the weight in void space doesn't mean anything because it's air. So it depends how that's regulated and where you are in the world. But there are a few which are Intertech is another one where there are kind of these bodies which are used for third-party auditing to say, yeah, okay, this is now credible. But usually it's a chain where you need to have the supplier base well understood. You need to understand what your BOM is. You need to have the company itself to say, okay, here's the data. You'll probably need to have some part of this, which is the software integrator or the data integrator, which will bring in different parts. Because if you just have Microsoft are fine, but Microsoft only want to work with Microsoft. They don't want to work with SAP, or they don't want to work with another platform. And so you probably need some data management system or an integrator that can pull data from all parts of this. And then you create your LCA. And then you can go to your third party auditor that then comes back again and says, yeah, okay, you have your thing. And then you can go, or at the same time as making your LCA, you'll also produce an EPD. And this is also where there's an interesting part that we haven't discussed here, where AI can come into things. But that's probably another story for another day. But that's where things could start to happen, maybe in a faster format. The problem here is where you're looking at AI. How is the AI regulated, and how can AI start to pull on that data and say, right, where is the objective? Because when you're looking at AI, yes, you can do it at a item level, at the SKU level, or you can kind of say, okay, but what's the objective of this? So what's the objective of the AI, and how does it bring in that data together in what is a fair format? What is a objective format, rather than it being a subjective one, or it learning from bad data? There was,
Yeah, it makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Makes sense. I think there's definitely a lot to unpack there, but I think we can
sure,
leave that for a next episode.
yeah.
Just thinking of the time, I think we can wrap it up with just one final question. If you had to have one big takeaway for design teams now that you've worked with many different companies going through this process of reflecting on their sustainability and maybe going through LCAs, what is one takeaway in terms of balancing sustainability and profitability?
That when you are looking at or when you're able to talk with your CFO, because usually your CFO, your sales guys, or anyone like that, they are interested in, what is my takeaway in the next quarter? How do I boost sales? How do I boost profit in my next 3 months? Sustainability doesn't work on the same timescale. And people need to be, and companies need to be, much more forward thinking. I would say on average, sustainability will come back to pay for itself in about a year and a half to 2 years. And then from that moment on, it's all cream, because then you're not paying the taxes. You're not paying any of these other on top fees that are coming in, which will cost you more money as a company. Yeah, sure, you can ignore it, pay fines and go for it, but invest the time and the money now. That will obviously be a cost at this time, but it will give you the insights. It'll give you the transparency that makes you able to make the correct decisions, that you're then able to say, right, now we can innovate into these areas. We can reduce our costs, and we can increase any of our branding and our marketing. We can increase our customer satisfaction, that will then push sales by, yeah, a year and a half, 2 years time. And at the
Sure.
same time being a responsible company.
Makes sense. I think that's a good place to end. James, this was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I also noted down a lot of acronyms. I think I'll be
Sorry for
including those in the description of the episode for our audience so that they can go and look that up more easily.
love it.
James, really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thanks a lot.
Bring